The fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in plastic as Laura Bennett pushed through the employee entrance of Cedar Creek Medical at 4:36 a.m., her badge clipped to ill-fitting scrubs that hung on her frame like borrowed clothes. She didn't belong here, that much was written across every inch of her body if anyone bothered to look. Military posture. Scar tissue on her forearms pale as old snow. Hands that moved with the precision of someone who'd sewn human flesh back together in the dark. But 8 months into her civilian nursing position, nobody looked close enough to see what she actually was. They saw a quiet woman in soft-soled shoes who never complained during double shifts, never made eye contact in the break room, never mentioned the folded flag she kept locked in her locker, the one from Marcus Chen, her last patient in Ramadi, who died in her arms in a field hospital built from sandbags and prayer. Laura moved through the ICU like a ghost. Badge number 4421. Laura Bennett, RN. 8 months, 3 days. Nobody needed to know that Captain Laura Bennett had spent 12 years commanding field hospitals across 3 continents, that she performed emergency surgery under mortar fire, that she could read the trajectory of a cardiac rhythm the way other people read text messages. She was here for one reason only. Admiral Marcus Hayes, her son's commanding officer, admitted yesterday for routine cardiac examination. Routine. She'd seen his name on the admission form and her entire body had gone still. Admiral Hayes returned from Ramadi 2 weeks ago exhibiting symptoms that screamed organophosphate exposure, tremors, confusion, night sweats. Symptoms the military doctors had dismissed as stress-related insomnia. Symptoms nobody else in this hospital would recognize because they were trained to look for heart disease, not chemical weapons residue lingering in a man's blood like ghosts. The morning report crackled over the intercom at 5:15 a.m. She was already in the ICU, already positioned outside his room, already reviewing his chart with the intensity of someone reading intelligence briefings. Vital stable. Heart rhythm normal. Chest X-ray clear. To everyone else, Admiral Hayes was a 56-year-old male with mild cardiac irregularities and stress-related fatigue. To Laura, he was a man being slowly poisoned and nobody in this hospital had the expertise to recognize it. She'd been monitoring his labs for 7 days, cross-referencing his exposure history with her own operational knowledge, building a timeline that matched perfectly with the 2009 deployment timeline he'd served under. Her son Marcus, 14 years old, named after the admiral his mother had once saluted in full dress uniform, had no idea that his mother spent her night studying cholinesterase levels and organophosphate binding mechanisms instead of sleeping. He had no idea that the woman making him breakfast every morning was a decorated Navy officer operating under deep cover in a hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, watching her former commanding officer die by degrees while everyone around her remained blind. Dr. Pierce first noticed something was wrong during the 6 a.m. medication rounds. Laura was drawing labs from Admiral Hayes's peripheral 4, her hands moving with that strange mechanical precision that made his skin crawl. 19 years as cardiothoracic chief of Cedar Creek Medical, and he'd learned to recognize competence the way a predator recognizes weakness, by hating it immediately. She should have looked nervous. She should have looked small. Instead, she looked like someone executing a task she'd rehearsed 1,000 times before. The 4 needle went in without tremor. The blood tube filled without spillage. She labeled the specimen with surgical neatness, her handwriting precise as a surgical diagram. Pierce watched from the doorway, his jaw tightening with the kind of rage that comes from recognizing expertise you can't control or suppress. Bennett. His voice came out sharp as a scalpel. What specific parameters are you tracking? Laura finished securing the sample without rushing. Her voice came out flat, without inflection. Comprehensive metabolic panel. Troponin. BNP levels. She paused, not looking at him. And cholinesterase. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Cholinesterase? Pierce stepped into the room, his movement carrying the weight of institutional authority. I don't recall ordering that test. It's routine. Laura turned from the patient, meeting his eyes for one moment before looking away, the precise gesture of someone trained to project deference while protecting something underneath. Given his symptom profile. Pierce's hands clenched. He'd spent 2 decades at Cedar Creek Medical building an empire of respect, of fear, of absolute dominion over the ICU hierarchy. Residents trembled when he entered a room. Nurses rearranged their entire shift around his preferences. And here was Bennett, 8 months in, a civilian nurse with no credentials beyond her RN, suggesting routine tests like she knew something he didn't. Like her symptom profile was worth discussing. His symptom profile, Pierce said slowly, is being managed under my care. Your job is to execute orders, not interpret them. Understood, Doctor. Laura secured the last full line with the kind of focused attention that suggested she'd already forgotten he was there. I'll deliver these to the lab. But as she moved past him into the hallway, Pierce caught sight of her chart notes from the previous shift. He developed the habit of reading her documentation obsessively, looking for mistakes, for anything that would justify his growing dislike. Instead, he found entries that made his hands clench. Not lazy. Not careless. Methodical. Thorough. Clinical observations that suggested someone trained in trauma assessment, not general nursing. She'd noted Admiral Hayes' subtle tremor in the extensor muscles of his hands. She documented increased salivation and lacrimation, tear production, and flagged it as potentially significant rather than incidental. She'd written the kind of detailed observation notes that belonged in a trauma surgeon's record, not a nurse's shift report. The note read, 1947 hours, patient presented with increased diaphoresis. Fine tremor noted in bilateral upper extremities. Assessment suggests possible acute exposure effects rather than cardiovascular etiology. Recommend expanded lab work before assuming primary cardiac involvement. Expanded lab work. Expanded lab work that a civilian nurse had no business recommending without consulting him first. Pierce crumpled the note in his fist and left the ICU at 6:32 a.m., his mind already working through the mechanics of how to make Laura Bennett understand her place in the hierarchy of Cedar Creek Medical. The day moved forward the way hospital days do, in controlled increments of blood pressure readings, medication schedules, and the constant low-level urgency that never quite tips into crisis. Laura moved through her tasks with invisible efficiency. By noon, she'd checked Admiral Hayes' vitals 18 times. She'd reviewed his updated labs with the kind of hunger that suggested they meant something beyond routine numbers. The cholinesterase levels were depressed. Not dangerously yet, but trending downward. She'd seen this pattern before in Ramadi, in Marines who'd been exposed to nerve agent residue during combat operations. Slow poisoning. The kind that the military doctors called post-deployment adjustment disorder when they didn't understand what they were looking at. At 2:15 p.m., her son's voice came through her phone in the break room. She'd stepped away from the chaos to take the call, standing by the window overlooking the parking lot where Atlanta's heat was radiating off the asphalt in visible waves. Mom, did you know Admiral Hayes is at your hospital? Marcus told me. He said his mom is chief of cardiology there or something. Laura's hand stilled. Admiral Hayes is a patient here, yes. That's so cool. Marcus said he's the best commanding officer he's ever had. Says he actually cares about his people. Are you, going to meet him or whatever? I'm a nurse, Marcus. I see many patients. She kept her voice level, betraying nothing of the calculated surveillance operation she'd been running for 8 days. I wouldn't presume to meet officers outside the scope of my nursing duties. Right, yeah, that makes sense. Hey, Mom, do you think, he paused, and she heard the specific hesitation of adolescents trying to articulate something important. Do you think people can just be good at things without being famous for it? Like, the best people nobody knows about. Laura closed her eyes. Yes, baby. I think that's exactly how the best people are. She hung up 14 seconds later, stepped back into the ICU at 2:38 p.m., and found Dr. Pierce waiting at the medication station with his arms crossed. He was holding her chart notes, all of them, collected from the past week, stacked like evidence. His smile was the kind that preceded thunder. Bennett, I've been reviewing your documentation. He laid the charts out like cards at a game he'd already won. And I'm noticing some concerning patterns. These observations about exposure effects. This clinical language that's frankly beyond your scope. Tell me, where exactly did you get your nursing degree? Laura gathered the charts without hurrying, rest-hacking them with perfect precision. Community college program, Atlanta. 3 years. And before that? Other work. She kept her eyes on the papers, each movement careful and small. Unrelated to healthcare. Pierce leaned against the counter, his posture designed to take up space. Your documentation reads like someone with more background than that suggests. Almost like military training. Almost like someone who shouldn't be working as a civilian nurse at all, but that's obviously absurd. He let the pause stretch. Isn't it? Laura looked up, and for exactly one moment before she controlled it, something else looked out through her eyes, something that had commanded Marines and made decisions that meant life or death. Then she blinked it away. I take my work seriously, Doctor. Her voice came out soft as it always did. That's all. Well, take it seriously in your own lane. Pierce stood, straightening his white coat with deliberate slowness. Because when you start suggesting diagnostic pathways that contradict my clinical judgment, you stop being helpful. You become a problem. And I don't tolerate problems on my floor. He left at 2:53 p.m., and Laura turned back to Admiral Hayes's vitals with a kind of focus that suggested the conversation had already slipped away from her attention. But her hands, when she checked the line, trembled for exactly 3 seconds before going still again. Wednesday grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical started like every other Wednesday, fluorescent panels casting their pale institutional glow across the conference room, 30 residents arranged in tiered seating like an amphitheater, and Dr. Pierce holding court at the center with the kind of posture that suggested he'd invented cardiothoracic surgery himself. Laura stood against the back wall, her hands folded at her sides, her scrub still damp from the mornings for placements. She'd learned weeks ago that standing in the back meant fewer eyes on her, meant Pierce would sometimes forget she was there at all. He didn't forget today. Grand rounds, Pierce announced, pulling a chart from the stack with theatrical slowness, is when we identify excellence and, more importantly, when we correct deficiencies. His voice had the texture of gravel, deliberate, grinding, the kind of voice that made younger residents sit straighter in their seats. He opened Admiral Hayes's file and held it up like evidence at trial. Let me read you something. This is actual nurse documentation from our own staff. He adjusted his glasses with one finger, a gesture calculated for maximum condescension. Neurological presentation suggests organophosphate exposure, recommend immediate chelation protocol and toxicology consult beyond standard cardiac workup. The residents shifted in their seats. 3 of them looked at each other. Can anyone tell me, Pierce continued, his voice dropping into that particular register reserved for rhetorical questions designed to humiliate, which medical school our nursing staff has been attending? Because Nurse Bennett seems to believe she's qualified not just to observe a patient, but to diagnose environmental toxin exposure and dictate treatment protocols. He paused, letting the silence crystallize. Tell me, Nurse Bennett, did you complete your medical degree during lunch breaks? Or are you simply playing doctor? The residents laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Nervous laughter, the kind that happens when a predator has marked its prey and everyone instinctively knows not to make eye contact. Laura's jaw clenched. Once. Hard enough that a muscle twitched visibly beneath her skin, a tremor of restraint so controlled it could have been mistaken for a nervous tic. Her hands remained steady at her sides, her fingers neither curling into fists nor trembling. Her face was a mask, not the kind that suggested she was fine, but the kind that suggested she had learned long ago that showing anything at all was a luxury she couldn't afford. She met Pierce's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then looked through him as though he'd already stopped existing. This, Pierce said, raising the chart higher, is what happens when we hire people who think watching medical dramas qualifies them for diagnostics. This is scope creep, residents. This is the moment where hospital quality begins to erode. So here's what we're going to do. He closed the chart with deliberate slowness. From this point forward, Nurse Bennett's charting will be reviewed for medical accuracy by my office before it enters the record. And Nurse Bennett, he turned directly toward the back wall, his smile sharp enough to cut, stay in your lane. We don't need nurses playing doctor. We need nurses following orders. The grand rounds continued, but something had shifted in the room. Laura could feel it in the way the residents' eyes avoided hers, in the sudden straightening of spines, in the unspoken memo that had just been broadcast through 30 minds. This nurse was not to be trusted, was not to be helped, was a cautionary tale wearing scrubs. She left the conference room at 11:53 a.m. and returned to her patient assignment with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested she'd already compartmentalized the humiliation into a locked drawer somewhere in the back of her mind. At 2:15 p.m., Laura approached the vending machine on the second floor, the one near the staff break room where the afternoon nurses usually gathered. Sarah and Jennifer were there, coffee cups steaming, mid-conversation about a patient in the ICU. Laura had shared coffee with both of them for times in the past month. They talked about their kids, about the exhaustion that never quite left your bones even after a day off, about the peculiar intimacy of people who held lives together for 12-hour shifts. "Hey," Laura said, her voice neutral, casual. She reached for the vending machine slot to buy a sparkling water. Sarah turned. Jennifer turned. And in the space of a single breath, they both physically repositioned themselves, shoulders angling away, bodies creating a barrier that was more effective than any words could have been. Sarah glanced back with an expression that looked like pity, which was somehow worse than anger, and then both of them walked away without responding, their footsteps echoing down the hallway with finality. Laura's hand hovered near the vending machine. She withdrew it without buying anything and turned back toward the corridor. She had 72 hours of documentation to complete before her shift ended at 11 p.m. Pierce passed her near the nurse's station not 20 minutes later, and he walked with his security chief, a man named Garrett whose job it was to manage hospital access and incident reports. Pierce's voice dropped into that particular register of casualness that only existed when someone was saying something damaging. "Keep an eye on Bennett's access badge," he said, loud enough for Laura to hear but directed entirely away from her, which made the instruction even more pointed. "I've got concerns about her stability, and we can't be too careful with patient safety. She's been accessing files outside her department. Could be nothing. Could be someone who's having a hard time coping with the demands of the job." Garrett nodded. Made a note on his tablet. Didn't look at Laura, which meant everyone in the vicinity would assume she was unstable enough to warrant monitoring. The logical response would have been to confront Pierce, to defend her integrity, to explain that her clinical observations came from medical knowledge, not instability. The logical response would have been to cry, to rage, to do something that would confirm every whisper he'd just planted. Instead, Laura continued charting. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the same steady precision they'd maintained in trauma bays during 0300 hours under small arms fire. Muscle memory. The body remembered how to function when the mind wanted to fracture. That evening in the nurse's locker room, she discovered someone had taped a children's toy stethoscope to her locker with a small note written in red marker, for playing pretend. The stethoscope was plastic, the kind meant for kids aged 4 and up, the kind that couldn't actually listen to anything, couldn't hear the truth of a patient's condition, couldn't distinguish between normal sinus rhythm and the electrical failures that would kill them. Laura removed the stethoscope without expression. She removed the note. She placed both items in the trash without allowing her face to shift even slightly, though her hands held the plastic stethoscope for perhaps 2 seconds longer than necessary. Then she changed out of her scrubs and drove home in silence, the Atlanta traffic moving around her like water around stone. Her son, Marcus, 14 years old and named after Admiral Hayes, which had seemed like a good idea 8 years ago when the Admiral had saved her late husband during a convoy ambush outside Ramadi, was doing homework at the kitchen table when she arrived. He looked up from his calculus worksheet, read her face with the particular skill of military children who can detect deployment stress from across a room. "Bad shift?" he asked. "Routine," she said, which was a lie so practiced it came out smooth as silk. "How was school?" He didn't push. Military kids learn early that some questions don't get answered, and that asking them anyway just makes things harder. He returned to his homework, and Laura moved through the motions of evening routine, changing clothes, preparing dinner, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table while they ate in the kind of comfortable silence that only existed between people who'd already survived the hardest parts of loss together. But that night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Laura did something she hadn't allowed herself to do in months. She went into her bedroom closet, the back corner, behind the winter coat she never wore in Atlanta, and she retrieved the small wooden box where she kept the flag. It was folded into that precise triangle that military ceremonies demanded, the corners sharp enough to cut, the fabric faded from 12 years of being pressed against her chest during funerals and separations and moments when she needed to remember what she'd been before she became someone's nurse. She sat on her closet floor, and she pressed that flag against her chest, and she let herself shake. 5 minutes. She'd learned long ago that 5 minutes was the maximum grief allocation. 5 minutes to remember Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, who'd been her corpsman in Ramadi, who'd taken shrapnel that was meant for her, who'd died before the helicopter could land. 5 minutes to remember the weight of his blood on her hands. 5 minutes to remember that she was the only one left from the unit still alive, and that meant 5 minutes was all she could afford. When the 5 minutes ended, she folded the flag again. She placed it back in the box. She reassembled the mask with the kind of precision that suggested it had never been broken at all, and she returned to the world as though the dissolution had never happened. The next morning, she arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 6:16 a.m., and her badge scanned without issue, which meant Garrett's monitoring hadn't escalated to physical restrictions yet. But that wasn't the worst part. What they didn't know was that Admiral Marcus Hayes' condition was deteriorating in ways that standard cardiac protocols would never catch. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of unfinished diagnosis. Laura stood at the cardiac monitoring station at Cedar Creek Medical, her eyes tracking the screen displaying Admiral Marcus Hayes' heart rhythm like a musician reading sheet music written in warning signs. The green line that should have been steady was becoming erratic. Small variations first, nothing alarming to anyone scanning the monitor casually. But Laura had spent 14 years reading the electrical language of damaged hearts. She had done it in field hospitals under fire. She had done it in cramped shipping containers converted to trauma bays. She recognized what was happening before the attending physician even entered the room. Organophosphate poisoning didn't announce itself with dramatic collapse. It accumulated. It whispered. The initial exposure in Ramadi had been months ago, but certain compounds, particularly the phosphorothioate class used in chemical weapons, metabolized slowly. They bound to acetylcholinesterase and refused to let go. The delayed cardiac manifestation was textbook for exposure levels in that range. The Admiral's autonomic nervous system was beginning its betrayal. His heart rate was 102, then 98, then 106. His QT interval was lengthening. The T waves were flattening. All of it screamed delayed cardiac toxicity from a toxin most cardiologists at Cedar Creek Medical had never treated outside of a medical school lecture. Laura moved with quiet precision. She pulled up his previous EKG from admission, unchanged, reassuring. She pulled up yesterday's monitor strips, normal sinus rhythm, steady as a metronome. She pulled up this morning's rhythm starting at 06 for 5 hours. The deterioration was accelerating. 2 hours of progressive changes. Not dramatic enough to trigger alarms yet. Insidious enough to kill him if nobody recognized what was happening. She flagged the nursing supervisor, her voice level and measured, "I need toxicology at bedside. Now." Organophosphate panel, specific attention to delayed cardiac manifestations. The supervisor, a woman named Margaret who had worked at Cedar Creek for 19 years, glanced at the monitor. "His rhythm looks okay to me, Laura. Elevated heart rate, sure, but his post-examination. That's normal." "It's not normal. It's progressive." Laura pulled up the strip comparison, showing the subtle deterioration across the hour. This pattern is textbook for organophosphate recirculation. His exposure was in Ramadi 3 months ago. Some compounds have extended half-lives. His acetylcholinesterase is being inhibited. His parasympathetic system is becoming hyperactive. His heart is responding to neurochemical overstimulation. Margaret studied the strips with genuine concern now, but Laura could see the hesitation in her face. In hospital hierarchies, nurses communicated concerns to physicians. Nurses did not make independent diagnoses. Nurses especially did not invoke 3-month-old military exposure as diagnostic rationale. Margaret said carefully, "I should loop in Dr. Pierce before we call toxicology. He's the attending." That was the moment Laura understood the magnitude of her problem. Dr. Pierce arrived at the cardiac ICU at 0903 hours like a man entering a theater he owned. He was wearing his white coat with the precision of armor, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a medal he'd awarded himself. He glanced at the Admiral's monitor, then at Laura's documentation, then at Laura herself with an expression that suggested she had just announced her intention to perform neurosurgery with a garden tool. "The Admiral's showing progressive tachycardia with QT prolongation," Laura said. She kept her voice clinical. She kept it brief. She did not ask permission. "Recommend immediate toxicology consult for organophosphate recirculation syndrome. Delayed manifestation is consistent with 3-month exposure timeline and recent travel history." Pierce's jaw tightened. He turned to face her directly, and the room around them seemed to contract. 3 residents were doing rounds nearby. Margaret was still at the nursing station. The attending cardiologist, Dr. Ellsworth, was reviewing another chart 12 feet away. Pierce spoke loudly enough for all of them to hear him. "The Admiral has straightforward cardiac disease, Nurse Bennett. Not your fantasy diagnosis from whatever military thriller you've been reading." He gestured at the monitor with theatrical dismissal. "This is normal post-examination tachycardia. Mild, transient. Responsive to observation. The rhythm deterioration is progressive over 2 hours," Laura said. The words came out flat. Her hands were steady. Her face revealed nothing. Inside her chest, something that felt like contained lightning was trying to escape. "This is not observation level. I'm aware of what I'm observing, nurse." Pierce turned to the residents, his voice taking on the didactic tone of a professor. "This is exactly the kind of scope creep that endangers patients. A nurse, competent within her limitations, begins reading medical journals and suddenly believes she has diagnostic authority. Standard cardiac protocol continues. Beta blockers, cardiac monitoring, and expectant management. No additional interventions without my explicit approval." He looked directly at Laura when he said it. He wanted her to hear the cage door closing. Laura said nothing. She documented everything. Her observations, her recommendations, the timeline, the rationale, the Admiral's exposure history as it appeared in his admission paperwork. She documented Pierce's explicit rejection of her findings and the specific time he ordered observation only. She used clinical language with the precision of someone building a case file. The documentation was her weapon now, a record that would outlast whatever came next. At 09 for 5 hours, Margaret pulled Laura aside. "Dr. Pierce is concerned about your state of mind. He told me you've been expressing significant anxiety about this patient and possibly over-identifying with him. He mentioned possible boundary issues." "What did he say exactly?" Laura's voice remained steady. Her hands remained steady. The 5 minutes of acceptable braking would not happen at Cedar Creek Medical. The 5 minutes would happen later, alone, somewhere nobody could see. "He didn't use those words," Margaret said carefully. "She was a good nurse. She was a bad liar. But he suggested that maybe it would be better if you were reassigned to another unit effective immediately. For everyone's safety." "Which unit?" "Pediatrics. Starting this afternoon." The irony was precise enough to be artful. Pierce was separating her from the cardiac ICU. He was removing her access to Admiral Hayes. He was removing her ability to monitor his condition, to document his deterioration, to sound an additional alarm when, not if, his condition crashed. At 1015 hours, Dr. Ellsworth, the attending cardiologist, stopped by the Admiral's room. Laura was still there, finishing her charting. She had 30 minutes left before her access badge would be restricted and she would cease to legally exist on this floor. "Laura, I heard you flagged some concerns about the Admiral's rhythm," Ellsworth said. He was 54, kind-faced, the kind of man who had been trained in an era when physicians still listened to nurses. "Walk me through your assessment." Laura showed him the strips. She showed him the timeline. She showed him the exposure history. She explained the organic phosphate compounds used in chemical weapons, their metabolism, their delayed cardiac manifestations. She used language learned in field medicine courses and combat trauma seminars that had never appeared on any civilian nursing certification. She sounded, despite everything, like someone who knew what she was talking about. Ellsworth studied the documentation. His expression shifted from polite attention to genuine concern. Then he said, "I think Dr. Pierce's approach is reasonable for now. But if the rhythm deterioration continues, we'll escalate to a more aggressive protocol." "Has anyone mentioned a toxicology consult?" Dr. Pierce declined to order one, Laura said. Ellsworth nodded slowly. He patted her shoulder with the kind of gesture you might give a child who had tried her best. "Let the doctors handle the medicine, sweetheart. You're doing good work, though. Really. Just stay in your lane." There was gentleness in it, which somehow made it worse than Pierce's contempt. At 1,145 hours, security appeared at the cardiac ICU entrance with a form for Laura's badge. Her access level was being modified effective immediately, they explained. She was no longer authorized for the cardiac intensive care unit. This was a temporary reassignment, pending administrative review. She could still access the pediatric floor, the break room, the main corridors. Just not cardiac. Just not the Admiral. Just not the person who was beginning his slow descent into a preventable catastrophe. Laura watched from the hallway as Pierce entered the Admiral's room at 1,203 hours. She could not see inside, but she could see his silhouette against the monitors. She could see him making adjustments to the fall line. She could see him pulling up information on the computer. Beta blockers. He was accelerating the protocol. He was giving the Admiral's parasympathetic system exactly what it did not need, medication that would further suppress acetylcholinesterase activity. For normal cardiac disease, it was standard. For organophosphate toxicity, it was a death sentence administered one dose at a time. The pediatric unit was on the 3rd floor. Laura took the stairs. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and something organic, someone's lunch, someone's fear, the accumulated scent of the thousands of people who had climbed these stairs hoping for good news. By 14:30 hours, the Admiral's monitor would show increasing dysrhythmias. By 1600 hours, his condition would deteriorate further. By 1847 hours Thursday evening, his heart would begin to fail entirely. And Laura would be on another floor, her badge restricted, her concerns documented and dismissed, her ability to intervene surgically severed by an administrative decision made by a man who had no idea he was murdering someone through the application of standard protocol. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was that she could not break her cover to save him. The worst part was that Admiral Hayes was dying on a cardiac unit in Atlanta, and the only person who knew how to save him had been systematically removed from the equation. The worst part was that her son's commanding officer was about to become a cautionary tale about the limitations of civilian medicine. Laura pushed through the stairwell door onto the pediatric floor at 1,435 hours. A nurse she did not recognize was passing vitals reports back and forth. A child somewhere was crying. The machines beat their different songs, higher-pitched, more urgent than the cardiac monitors downstairs. Nothing was wrong here. Everything was just fine here. The cardiac ICU alarm sounds at 10:02 a.m. Not the routine monitor alarm that bleeds through hallway speakers. The emergency alert. The code blue siren that makes every nurse's shoulders tighten and every doctor's pace quicken. Laura is 2 floors down in pediatrics, charting vitals for a 7-year-old with pneumonia, when the sound cuts through the hospital like a blade. She knows that rhythm. She's heard it before. Once in Ramadi. Twice in forward surgical. Admiral Hayes. Her hands move before her brain finishes the thought. She's already standing. Already walking. Already running toward the stairwell because the elevator will eat 30 seconds she doesn't have. The pediatric unit badge reader swipes her out without hesitation. The ICU badge reader stops her cold. The red light. The angry electronic beep. Access denied. Pierce's sabotage, still working, still keeping her separated from the patient she was meant to monitor. She's pounding on the glass, watching the code team scramble inside through the window, when a junior resident, a third-year named Choi, panic-stricken and drowning in his own incompetence, holds the door open from the inside without asking questions. Sometimes fear recognizes desperation. She enters a room that smells like antiseptic and electricity. The monitors shriek. Hayes is slumped in his ICU bed, skin gray, fingers clawed. The attending physician is calling for standard ACLS protocol, defibrillation pads, epinephrine push, the textbook response that works for 90% of cardiac arrests and fails catastrophically for the 10% caused by organophosphate poisoning. Laura can read his rhythm the way other people read their own names. Not ventricular fibrillation. Not asystole. The flattened, chaotic pattern she last saw on a soldier's monitor in a blood-soaked tent 23 kilometers outside Fallujah. Organophosphate toxicity doesn't respond to standard defibrillation. It won't respond to drugs. Hayes's heart has literally forgotten how to beat correctly. The muscle itself is poisoned. The attending physician is young, competent, and absolutely wrong. He's already charging the defibrillator. 3 residents stand frozen around the bed like ornaments. The crash cart sits 8 feet away. Laura doesn't wait for permission. Waiting for permission is what dead patients do. She moves across the room like something with a target locked on it. The scalpel is a 14-centimeter stainless steel blade meant for minor laceration repair. She's held larger instruments. She's held worse instruments. She's held bone saws in sandstorms and retractors while her own blood dripped onto the surgical field. Her hands know what to do. Her hands have always known. The attending physician turns toward her, his mouth opening, a question or a protest. She never finds out, because she's already making the incision. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. Fast. Muscle memory. 4th intercostal space. The blade slides through skin and adipose tissue like it's opening a letter. Blood wells up, hot and immediate. She doesn't pause. The periosteum, the membrane around the ribs, parts under the scalpel with a sound like fabric tearing. The pleural space opens and the lung collapses away from the incision like a frightened animal. She reaches in without hesitation. She's reached into worse. The attending is shouting something. The residents are frozen. Someone is crying, though Laura's not sure who. Her hands move with the terrifying fluid precision of autopilot, 43 muscle groups firing in a sequence that was burned into her nervous system by 100 surgeries conducted while mortars impacted outside the surgical tent. Her fingers find the pericardium. She can feel it under her fingertips like a water balloon swollen with blood. The knife opens it cleanly. Pericardial fluid drains across her palm. And there is the Admiral's heart. Purple-gray and barely moving. Barely trying. Suction, she says. One of the residents fumbles for it. The vacuum hisses. Retractor. I need visualization. Her voice doesn't sound like her voice anymore. It sounds like it's coming from a radio broadcast of someone else's life. Steady. Clinical. Impossible. The resident hands her the surgical retractor. She positions it to open the pericardium wider, and now she can see the entire heart. The coronary arteries. The right atrium. The left ventricle that should be driving 60 to 100 beats per minute and is instead barely fluttering like something dying. She doesn't think. She cups the heart in her hand, the organ the size of a fist, still trying, still beautiful even poisoned, and begins direct manual cardiac compression. Her palm becomes the left ventricle. Her fingers become the right atrium. She compresses and releases with the rhythm that's lived in her bones since the first time she saved a life in the sand. The heart is warm. The heart is her responsibility. The heart is, against all institutional protocol and state medical board regulations and every attorney working for Cedar Creek Medical, going to keep beating. Come on, Admiral, she whispers. Come on. 1 compression. 2. 3. The blood that's pooling in his chest cavity makes her hand slick, red, warm like it's freshly alive. 4. 5. The rhythm is changing. The monitors are still screaming, but the pattern is tightening, organizing itself, the chaos becoming architecture. 6. 7. The heart is responding. The heart is, her fingers feel it before the monitor announces it, the heart is remembering how to beat. Sinus rhythm appears on the monitor like a miracle no one was asking for. 62 beats per minute. Steady. Alive. The Admiral's lungs expand. His color shifts from gray toward something resembling human. Laura keeps her hand in his chest for another 12 seconds, waiting, ensuring, knowing that sometimes the heart lies and pretends to beat before it stops again. But this time it holds. This time it's real. She withdraws her hand. She's covered in blood that isn't hers. Her scrubs are soaked. There's blood in her hair. The attending physician is staring at her like she's manifested out of the wall. The residents are absolutely motionless. Someone's monitor beeping is the only sound in a room that should be filled with her explaining what she just did, how she just did it, why she was qualified to do it. Admiral Hayes takes a breath. Takes another. His eyes flutter open. His hand moves. He's alive because she didn't wait for permission. The attending finds his voice. Get cardiothoracic down here now. Get a perfusionist. We need to get him intubated, and he stops mid-sentence because Dr. Pierce has just walked through the door. Pierce's eyes move from the Admiral, who is breathing, to Laura, who is standing over him blood-soaked and silent, to the monitors, which are displaying something that directly contradicts everything Pierce diagnosed and everything Pierce prescribed. His face goes white. Then red. Then the color of old concrete. What the hell, he says, not a question, did you do? Laura meets his eyes. She doesn't answer. She doesn't need to. The Admiral is alive. That's the answer. That's the only answer that matters. Pierce's phone is already in his hand. He's leaving the room, his voice rising as he moves into the hallway. Call the board. All 3 of them. Now. His voice carries through the ICU like a toxin. She performed an authorized surgery. Emergency intervention. She's unstable, she's dangerous, and she's a liability. Laura watches him disappear around the corner. She turns back to the Admiral, whose hand fumbles forward and grips her wrist with what little strength organophosphate-poisoned muscles can manage. His lips move. His voice comes out barely above a whisper, Nightingale. He knows. Somehow, somewhere, he knows. Security arrives at 2:04 p.m. Not gently. Not quietly. The badge confiscation happens in front of 6 residents. The escorting out of Cedar Creek Medical happens through the main lobby. The firing is official, effective immediately, with citations about scope of practice violations and patient safety concerns and unauthorized use of hospital facilities, happens in a room with 3 lawyers and a hospital administrator who won't make eye contact. At 4:48 p.m., Laura sits at her kitchen table with the folded flag pressed against her sternum, a piece of cloth and thread that contains an entire human being, an entire sacrifice, an entire life she couldn't save in a combat situation, but somehow, impossibly, she saved the Admiral instead. She's shaking. Not trembling. Shaking. The difference matters. One is fear. One is adrenaline leaving her system like water draining from a tub, leaving her hollow and raw. Her 14-year-old son, Marcus, finds her that way. Finds his mother, who he's never seen break, who he's never seen cry, who transforms into something solid and unbreakable in crisis, crying at the kitchen table. He doesn't ask questions. He disappears into her bedroom closet without a word. When he returns, he's carrying the shadow box. Inside are 4 items that Laura never wanted him to see. The Navy Cross, gold and ribbon blue, awarded for actions above and beyond the Silver Star. The Silver Star itself, smaller, brilliant, earned in a tent while her hand stopped shaking long enough to save 43 lives in 17 hours. The captain's insignia, 2 railroad tracks and an oak leaf cluster. And a folded citation on aged parchment that starts with the phrase, "for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces." Marcus places the shadow box on the kitchen table between them and says quietly, with the certainty of a child who knows his mother isn't lost but is somewhere underneath the breaking, "Mom, they need to see these." The security escort came at 1:41 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, 2 officers in pressed uniforms with the kind of apologetic expressions that meant they'd received their orders from someone higher up the chain. Laura didn't fight it. She'd already known, the moment Dr. Pierce's outside investigator from the State Medical Board had arrived at 1:53 p.m. with a leather briefcase and the kind of smile that only comes from being paid to destroy someone. 30 minutes. That's all it took for the board's investigator to decide that Laura's emergency field thoracotomy, a procedure that had saved Admiral Hayes' life, violated every protocol that governed civilian nursing practice. The investigator hadn't asked about the patient's outcome. Hadn't asked about the Admiral's current cardiac rhythm or his oxygen saturation or whether he was still breathing. Just, unauthorized procedure, scope creep, potential fraud, security will escort you from the premises immediately. The walk to the parking lot felt longer than it should have. 14 months she'd worked at Cedar Creek Medical. 14 months of double shifts and compassionate care and watching patients recover under evidence-based protocols that she'd quietly introduced, rewritten, perfected. All of it erased in 30 minutes because she'd saved the wrong patient in front of the wrong doctor. Her badge, the one Pierce had already arranged to have security monitor, was confiscated by a woman named Chen who looked genuinely uncomfortable doing it. The badge clattered against the concrete as Laura set it down on the security desk, that small metallic sound like the closing of a door, like the end of something. She drove home in silence. No radio. No podcasts about medical breakthroughs or military history or any of the things that usually filled the quiet spaces in her car. Just the sound of her own breathing and the rain beginning to fall on the windshield and the knowledge that everything she'd sacrificed, 18 years in the Navy, 3 tours in Ramadi, a promotion that would have made her admiral material, her son's stable childhood, had been burned down because she couldn't let a patient die. By 5 p.m., Laura sat at her kitchen table in her apartment overlooking Peachtree Street, still wearing her scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and her own failure. The folded flag, the one from her teammate Martinez, the one she'd carried through 16 years of active service and 8 months of civilian cover, was pressed against her chest again. Her son Marcus came home from school at 5:23 p.m., found her at that table, and didn't ask questions the way most 14-year-olds would. He just looked at her and knew something fundamental had broken. "You're home early," he said, not quite asking. "I lost my job," Laura said, the words strange in her mouth. Not technically true, she'd been fired, escorted out, her cover blown in front of 3 board members and the investigator and a room full of nurses who'd probably been told she was unstable, unqualified, dangerous. But the simplest version was, she'd lost her job. She'd lost her mission. She'd lost the careful architecture of lies that had kept her close enough to Admiral Hayes to monitor his declining health and far enough away to seem like nobody important. Marcus didn't speak. He watched her for exactly 7 seconds, she counted it, old habit, and then he disappeared into her bedroom closet. The sounds of him moving through boxes, searching through the things she kept carefully hidden under winter sweaters and old paperback novels, carried down the hallway. When he emerged, he was holding the shadow box. The one containing her Navy Cross. Her Silver Star. Her captain's insignia, along with the medals that marked 3 tours in combat zones and a psychological endurance that most people would never understand. He placed it on the kitchen table without ceremony. "Mom," he said quietly, with the certainty of a child who knows his mother isn't lost but is somewhere underneath the breaking. They need to see these. She couldn't speak. The shadow box sat between them like proof of everything she'd tried to bury, evidence of a life she'd thought was finished, decorations from a woman who didn't exist anymore. Except she did exist. She was sitting at this kitchen table in scrubs with hospital ID marks still visible on her shirt, and her son had just reminded her that the woman who'd earned those medals was the same woman who'd saved Admiral Marcus Hayes with nothing but a combat knife and 18 years of surgical experience and the absolute refusal to watch another person die. The next morning, Marcus walked into the hospital administrator's office during what should have been Dr. Pierce's triumph meeting with the board. The shadow box was in his hands, 14 years old, in his Cedar Creek High School hoodie, placing a piece of military history on a mahogany conference table in front of 7 board members who had no idea what they were looking at. Laura learned later what happened next from the Marine Guard who'd accompanied Admiral Hayes that morning. How Marcus hadn't said anything. How he just placed the box down and stepped back. How Admiral Hayes, still weak from his cardiac event but standing now, fully awake and recovered because of the procedure Dr. Pierce had fought so hard to prevent, had whispered her call sign across that room like a ghost returning from the dead, Nightingale 6 Actual. The Marines had unfolded her Silver Star commendation and read it aloud in that conference room, voices steady and precise, the way military voices become when they're speaking official citations. 11 consecutive trauma surgeries performed under fire in Ramadi while simultaneously commanding a field hospital evacuation. Exposed to hostile fire throughout, providing surgical intervention under conditions of extreme duress. Extraordinary heroism in the face of direct enemy engagement. Her name. Her rank. Every classified detail they were theoretically not allowed to mention but did anyway because she'd earned it, and the Marines who served under her were not going to let a civilian board take that from her. Then came the 3-star general who'd flown in from Norfolk specifically for this meeting. He'd saluted her decorations before the Pentagon liaison delivered her operational code name to a room of stunned board members who were just beginning to understand that they'd spent the last 24 hours trying to destroy someone they had no authority to touch. The liaison had pulled up her classified service record on his laptop, redacted in places, but enough to show that Captain Laura Bennett had saved the Admiral's life as part of an active federal intelligence operation. That Dr. Pierce's interference with the emergency procedure constituted obstruction of a military investigation. That his attempt to have her fired was potentially criminal. Dr. Pierce had tried to interrupt. Laura imagined it clearly, his face flushing, his hands gripping the table, the words coming out fast and defensive, protocols, credentials, scope of practice. Medical law, not military protocol. And then someone had turned the hospital administrator's laptop toward him. The video. The grand rounds humiliation that had gone viral in military family networks across 4 southeastern states. His own voice, mocking, dismissive, cruel. His own medical school mentor, a retired Army surgeon named Holloway who'd trained him 40 years ago, had already sent an email to the board disowning him, demanding a formal review of his fitness to lead. The email had 7 signatures attached from other senior physicians, all with military backgrounds, all saying the same thing: this man has no business treating anyone. The security escort came for Dr. Pierce at 10:33 a.m. that morning. His access badge confiscated in the same conference room where he'd planned his victory speech. Administrative leave, pending investigation. Effective immediately. The 3 board members who'd taken his calls about Laura's supposed credential fraud recused themselves when the Pentagon liaison provided documentation that they'd interfered with an active military operation. The state medical board investigator, the one Pierce had specifically requested, filed a complaint against Pierce instead, noting that he'd made false statements about an emergency medical procedure that had saved a patient's life, that his interference had placed that patient at additional risk, that his pattern of hostility toward clinical staff suggested a fitness to practice concern. The days that followed saw Pierce's carefully constructed network unravel like a sweater pulled at a loose thread. His grand rounds video spread beyond military networks into medical professional forums where physicians who trained under him began sharing their own stories. How he'd humiliated a junior resident for suggesting a transfusion protocol change. How he delayed a pediatric valve replacement for 6 hours because a nurse questioned his timing. How he'd walked out of surgery and left a technician to close a patient because someone had contradicted him during rounds. His former resident submitted formal complaints about hostile work environment and patient care delays caused by his ego-driven protocols. The hospital conducted an audit of his cardiac outcomes over the past 3 years and discovered his mortality rates exceeded peer institutions by 23% because he'd been using outdated protocols while systematically dismissing staff input from people who actually understood current evidence-based medicine. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a story about military veterans receiving substandard care at civilian hospitals, featuring anonymous quotes from Cedar Creek staff about Pierce's treatment of Admiral Hayes. The article included statistics about veteran health outcomes and a paragraph about the importance of listening to clinical observations from all levels of the care team. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. Pierce tried to give interviews defending himself, but each appearance made it worse. He couldn't explain why he'd blocked a life-saving procedure. Couldn't articulate why he'd restricted the badge of the person who'd saved his patient. Couldn't justify humiliating a decorated Navy captain in front of residents. His wife left him when the video reached her social circle. His country club membership was suspended. His speaking invitation at the National Cardiothoracic Conference was revoked. 6 weeks later, Laura stood in her new office as Chief of Emergency Medicine at Cedar Creek Medical, a position created specifically to bring military-grade trauma protocols to civilian care. The hospital had installed new equipment, tourniquet stations, resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta kits, proper emergency thoracotomy trays, and completely rewritten the trauma protocols based on her recommendations. Her patient outcomes were already better. Her staff respected her. Admiral Hayes had written a formal commendation for the hospital's new veteran care protocol that she'd authored, and 6 other hospitals across the Southeast were already implementing it. Through her office window, she watched Dr. Pierce load medical supplies into a transport van in the parking lot. His new role, the only position where his medical license could remain active without patient contact. Driving equipment between clinics. Spending the next 3 years in administrative exile if he wanted to avoid a formal medical board hearing. The rain was falling again, the kind of rain that sounds like distant applause, and Laura didn't feel satisfaction or anger watching him work. Just the quiet awareness that competence always surfaces eventually. She placed the folded flag on her desk next to a photograph of Marcus and Admiral Hayes together, both smiling. The shadow box hung on the wall above her diplomas, Navy Cross, Silver Star, Captain's insignia, all of it visible now, all of it finally allowed to exist in the light. Her son appeared in her doorway as she was arranging them, the way he did most afternoons, studying the medals like he was reading proof of something. They needed to see these, he said again, echoing his words from that kitchen table. Laura looked at him, 14 years old, steady, intelligent, the kind of child who understands that sometimes people have to break in order to be put back together correctly. They did, she said quietly. Thank you for understanding that. Admiral Hayes visited the following week, fully recovered now, his organophosphate poisoning treated and his medical status upgraded to combat-ready pending final clearance. The Navy had launched a full investigation into contaminated water supplies affecting 17 veterans from the Ramadi deployment, an investigation that Laura's clinical observations had triggered, an investigation that was now saving lives. He presented her with a commendation from the Secretary of the Navy, the kind of recognition that didn't require silence or secrecy or hiding who you were. The kind that said, you served. You sacrificed. You saved us. And now we're going to say it out loud. That evening, as Marcus headed upstairs to finish his homework, Laura turned back to her desk where 3 more patient charts waited, veterans with unexplained symptoms that standard protocols were missing, the way the admirals had been missed. She opened the first file, her hand steady, and began her work again. Her voice, when she finally spoke to her son at the door, had dropped an octave. Not quiet anymore. Not deferential. Just capable, certain, commanding the space she occupied the way only someone who'd survived can do. Power is not a title, she said. Power is the ability to help. If you've ever felt underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you need to subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of the people nobody saw coming, the ones whose strength was invisible until the moment it changed everything. Like this video, comment below, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story of hidden heroes walking among us.